All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 63, 4th year, December. Wednesday, the 4th of December, 1974. As promised, McGonagall gave them all 3 weeks of detention, which meant lines and extra homework. To ensure that they were properly penitent, she also banned them from Hogsmeade until the new year, which Peter seemed particularly upset about, for some reason, even after James had assured him that they'd still be able to sneak over to Honeydukes for sweets. Sirius, however, had more important things to worry about than missing out on a few Zonkos runs and a handful of butterbeers at the Three Broomsticks. The problem he found himself facing as November surrendered quietly to December was much more concerning than any detention, more frightening than McGonagall's anger, and even more baffling than the voice-changing charm that Flitwick had them all working on. Girls. Sirius's problem that he had to deal with, once again, was girls. Ever since Peter had spilled the beans about the snogging bet, they'd started following him around. He hadn't noticed at first, paying no mind to the giggling groups of friends that seemed to materialise wherever he was, studying in the library, playing gobstones in the common room, walking with his mates to get breakfast in the great hall. He'd assumed that they just also happened to be there, largely unobtrusive background noise. Sirius Black was not particularly observant, not unless something was worth observing. But then, one evening, Remus snapped. The Marauders were studying in the library. Well, Remus and James were studying. Peter had fallen asleep on his astronomy book, and Sirius was trying to figure out how he could charm the constellations off the pages and onto Peter's face. One table over from them was a group of girls that had been giggling and whispering for the past half hour. After a particularly high-pitched round of squealing, Remus slammed his hands down on the table. "That's it," he declared, shoving his chair back to stand. "I'm leaving." "What?" Sirius looked up from where he had his wand poised over Peter's nose. He'd just managed to move the Capricorn onto the bridge. "Honestly, Black, can't take you anywhere. Can hardly hear myself think," Remus grumbled, collecting his things. James shook his head, amused. "What are you on about?" Sirius demanded, indignant at being blamed for whatever it was that Remus was so upset about. He had been perfectly silent, but on his best behaviour. He'd even whispered as he cast his spell. Remus shot a meaningful look towards the table of girls, glaring. Sirius blinked, then turned around, craning his neck to see what Moony was referring to. Another fit of giggles had erupted as the girls saw him staring. "What? Oh, you can't blame me for that. I haven't even done anything." Remus huffed, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "I can't take you anywhere in this bloody castle without your entourage following along. Ever since you started this stupid bet, it's impossible to get anything done." With that, he stumped off, leaving Sirius stunned and James trying to stifle his laughter. Peter snorted on the table, jerking awake and leaving a smear of drool across the pages of his book. "What?" he asked, blinking sleep from his eyes, looking around, disorientated. "What's going on, James?" But now James was shaking, desperately trying to keep his laughter quiet so as to avoid drawing the wrath of Madame Pince. Sirius just rolled his eyes, pulling out his Transfiguration essay with a sigh. Peter looked down and noticed the blank patch on his page. "Oi! What's happened to my book?" After Remus's outburst, Sirius began to notice the girls. At first, he found it quite flattering. After all, he had always enjoyed an audience, and it certainly added to his reputation that he was now Hogwarts' resident heartthrob. Sirius strutted about, smiling rakishly and winking, just to see what reaction it got. His friends insisted that he was acting ridiculous, but he insisted that they were all just jealous. But then the love notes started. Sirius would wake up to find colourful envelopes shoved underneath the door to their room, or his breakfast interrupted by a flock of owls bearing perfumed missives. It got annoying very quickly, especially because none of the girls were particularly creative with their writing. It was all just a bunch of daft, mushy nonsense. Being followed about the halls quickly got old, too. It was all well and good to have admirers sometimes, but it was hardly practical when one had mischief to attend to. Sirius couldn't very well carry out any pranks if he had at least 6 pairs of eyes constantly watching his every move. One day, after futilely trying to shake off a gaggle of devotees that had been trailing him from the library all the way to the common room, Sirius had had enough. Luckily, Mary just happened to be stepping through the portrait hole at the exact moment he arrived. "MacDonald!" he called, hurrying over to her. She paused, raising a brow. "Black?" She had become much more easy to talk to, ever since getting a boyfriend, now that Sirius knew exactly where things stood between them. He didn't have to worry whether there was some subtextual meaning to every sideways glance or subtle movement. "Quick! Come revise astronomy with me." "What? Why?" Her question was quickly answered by the group of girls bursting around the portrait hole. She rolled her eyes at him. "Oh, come on, Sirius." "Please," he hissed, both her hands in his. "Oh, most generous, magnanimous, ethereal, beautiful—" All right, she laughed, shaking him off. "I'll revise with you, but only if you proofread my essay for McGonagall." "Done," he agreed, grinning. They chose a desk near the fireplace, settling down. His pursuers hung back, eyeing Mary with a mix of confusion and jealousy. She stared right back at them, challenging, until they looked away. "Honestly, Black," she shook her head, sliding her parchment across the table. "The messes you get yourself into." "I am forever in your debt," Sirius promised solemnly, and she laughed. "Right. Get reading then. Go on." Friday, the 20th of December, 1974. As the month drew on, the weather grew drier, the nights longer, the sunlight weaker. As if in defence to the gloomy environment, the entire Hogwarts castle seemed to embrace the Christmas spirit, more eager than ever for the holidays. Fairy lights adorned every passageway, owls swooped about with brightly coloured packages every morning, and Professor Sprout enchanted holly and ivy to wave around every chandelier and banister. In the evening, Professor Flitwick could be found teaching the portraits to sing carols, and even McGonagall was sporting very festive in green and red robes. Sirius, always happy to do his part, contributed to the holiday spirit by starting a new trend. He ended the term dressed head to toe in tinsel. To be fair, it hadn't actually been his idea. James had been the originator, using an everlasting sticking charm to attach decorations to collars and cuffs of Sirius's robes while he slept. But Sirius had made the look his own, strutting about the halls with his head held high, so that everyone could see the shimmering addition to his clothing. By the last day of term, he had at least 15 other boys trying to copy his look, as well as various girls who continued, still, to follow him around. Unfortunately, none of Sirius's efforts to shake off his followers seemed to make much difference as long as the bet was still on, and he couldn't very well back out. A Gryffindor never admitted defeat. Instead, Sirius found himself enlisting Mary as a bodyguard more and more frequently, seeking her out whenever he needed a reprieve from the giggling teenagers. She didn't seem to mind, although she often took the opportunity to blackmail him into helping her with Transfiguration, which resulted in Sirius doing quite a bit more schoolwork than he'd intended over the course of the month. "You're such a wuss," she sighed on the last evening of term, as they all sat around the fireplace together. James was playing with a golden snitch he'd nicked from the games shed, very clearly trying to impress Lily with his quick reflexes. He didn't seem to be having much luck. The redhead was bent over her Christmas cards, scribbling frantically with frightening focus. Peter, who could usually be counted on to ooh and ah appropriately at James's Quidditch-related antics, was nowhere to be found. Instead, Marlene sat playing a chess game with Remus, who seemed very happy to be winning for once. Peter was a monster when it came to chess. Sirius had called over Mary to sit closer to him, wary of the group of girls that stood watching him from the corner. "I'm not a wuss," he responded dryly, loosening his tie. "I just like my privacy." "You could always just snog one of them," Mary shot back, draping her legs over his lap as she stretched out on the couch. He rested his arms on the top of her shins. By now he'd grown used to Mary's touchiness, and no longer minded it. In fact, Sirius found he quite liked the coziness of it, safe in the knowledge that the contact was entirely platonic. She smirked at him. Wasn't that the whole point of the bet? "Well, yeah," Sirius replied carefully. "But they weren't supposed to know about it. I was supposed to win them over with my charm and ruggish good looks." "You're not Scared of them, are you? Mary teased, nudging his leg with her toes. I'd be mad not to be scared of girls, he laughed lightly. You're all mental. Mary, what's Darren's surname? Lily asked, looking up from her stack of cards. Harvey, Mary said. God, you're not sending him a card, are you? You've only met him once. It's nice to get cards at Christmas, Lily murmured absent-mindedly, smiling as she returned to her writing. All right, but don't send an owl, he's a muggle. How have you been writing to him all year? Looking up from where he had just checked Marlene's king. I send letters to Mum. She pops them through his letterbox. He only lives across the hall. There's a phone box just outside Hogsmeade, so we've chatted there once or twice. I didn't know there was a phone box. Yeah, it's a bit ancient. One of the Ravenclaws told me it was a portkey once during the war, but it still works. She stretched again, heel digging into Sirius's thigh. Can't wait to see him. I can't wait to see him. Sirius, who got consistently excellent grades in Muggle studies, had managed to understand about half of this conversation. Mary's heel was still digging into his leg, so he pushed her away, pretending to lean over to watch the chess game. What are you doing for Christmas, Remus? Lily asked, licking her final envelope. Sirius noted, with amusement, the way James's eyes widened as he watched her tongue dart out of her mouth. Not staying here, I hope. Lupin and Black are coming to mine again. James jumped in, eager for her attention. She gave him a withering look. Oh, of course. Sirius grinned, amused by Lily's continued dismissal of Potter. The spurred boy watched her turn back to her letters with a rapturous expression, as if he couldn't believe the good luck he'd had to have her address him directly. I'm starving, Sirius announced, yawning. Where's Pete? Can we send him down to the kitchens for us? No idea where he is, actually, James said, now watching as Lily neatly stacked her cards. Haven't seen him since dinner. Is he packing? Lily suggested. I'll go check, Remus said, having just won this game of chess. He stretched as he stood, shoulders rolling languidly beneath his jumper. I'm hungry too. I think there are some cauldron cakes in my trunk. You don't say! Sirius bounced to his feet, following him. Remus gave him a long, suffering sigh, but didn't protest. As possessive as he was over his food, Sirius was always able to convince him to share. Peter was nowhere to be found in the dorm room, but the cauldron cakes were. Wonder what's happened to him, Remus mused, rubbing the back of his head. Check the map, Sirius suggested around a mouthful of cake, spraying crumbs everywhere as he spoke. Remus raised a brow, but refrained from chastisement, instead retrieving the map from his bedside table. Sirius watched as he cast the locator spell, a small flag quickly appearing, highlighted with the name Peter Pettigrew. Their friend appeared to be in the broom cupboard just outside the charms classroom. What's he doing there? Sirius mumbled, cramming another cake into his mouth. Remus tutted disapprovingly, folding up the map. I don't know. You don't reckon the Slytherins got him, do you? Maybe, Sirius swallowed. If they put a binding spell on him, he might be stuck there all night. Let's go get him, then. Shall I get James? Sirius hesitated, glancing towards the door. He thought about the group of girls hovering in the corner of the common room. Nah, let's just take the cloak and sneak down. It won't take long, and only two of us fit anyway. Sirius doubted that James would care. He seemed perfectly content to stay put in front of the fire as long as Evans was there, and likely wouldn't even notice their absence. Remus shrugged, not seeming to mind much either way, and went to go grab the cloak. They huddled together, shuffling quickly downstairs and sneaking past James and the girls, out through the portrait hall. Bloody typical of Peter, Sirius murmured. 4 years as a marauder, and he's still crap at defensive spells. Maybe they attacked him from behind, Remus responded, voice low. Or maybe there were a lot of them. He was standing slightly behind Sirius, so that the words were murmured directly into his ear. They were so close that he could feel Mooney's breath hot under the cloak against his skin. It was irritating. It made him want to shiver. They continued through the shadowy stone hallways until they reached the charms corridor, drawing to a stop in front of an unassuming wooden door. Here, isn't it that one? Yeah, Remus replied. He's in there. Okay, wand ready? 1, 2, 3! 3! Sirius yanked open the door, revealing a very shocked Peter, who most certainly was not in any danger, and Desdemona Lewis, who shrieked, "Who's there?" She stared out at the corridor, eyes wide, with her hair amused, lips shiny with spit. Peter peered out as well, just as rumpled, but considerably more suspicious. "Probably just Peeves." Sirius began to shudder, choking on his laughter, and Remus clamped down a hand over his mouth, pressing warm fingers into his skin. The taller boy wrapped an arm around his shoulders, trying to tug him away from the cupboard. "I'm going back to my common room. I'll get in so much trouble if I'm caught out of bounds again," Desdemona said, straightening out her blouse. She kissed Peter primly on the nose. "See you tomorrow, Petey. On the train?" Yeah, okay," Peter replied, distracted as he scanned the corridor, eyes narrowing warily. Sirius struggled against Remus's arm, but the boy was surprisingly strong. He could feel muscles bunching beneath the jumper, grip tightening, and fingers pressing into his jaw. His palms smelled like ink. It wasn't until Desdemona had disappeared around the corridor that Remus released his grip, allowing Sirius to stumble forward by a step. By now Peter already knew that they were there. "All right, show yourselves," he demanded, pulling out his wand just as they burst out from under the invisibility cloak. "I knew it!" Peter yelled. "You sneak!" Sirius crowed, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "How long has that been going on?" "A week," Peter said sullenly, flushed. "How did you find me?" "A week! Merlin, Pettigrew! What do you think you're about, lying to us for a whole week? You would have teased me. We'd tease you anyway." "Can we please go to the kitchens now?" Remus sighed. "Wait until James hears about this," Sirius chuckled, shaking his head. "I can't believe it. I really can't. Peter Pettigrew, ladies' man." "Oh, shut up," Peter grumbled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I'm going to the common room. I'm not hungry." "Well, the way you were eating Lewis's face off—" "Shut up," Peter snapped, stomping off down the corridor. Sirius couldn't stop laughing all the way to the kitchens, and he was still giggling hysterically on the way back, arms full of treats and goodies from the house elves. "At least this means that stupid snogging race is over," Remus said, sounding quite pleased as they approached the portrait hole of the fat lady. Sirius froze, horrified as the implications of that statement sunk in. Unfortunately, Remus was directly behind him. He nearly dropped his bottle of butterbeer as they collided. "Ugh, I didn't think of that." "Well, you don't have to think about it now," Remus said irritably, frowning as he rubbed his elbow where he'd just banged it. Pete won. "You're right, Mooney. Ugh! That means that if I don't get a snog by the end of the year, then I'm more of a loser than Pettigrew." Remus sighed, shaking his head as he stepped around Remus to return to the common room. Chapter 64. 4th Year, Christmas. Monday the 23rd of December, 1974. Though they left behind picturesque mountains of glittering snow at Hogwarts, the marauders were greeted in London by a grey, southern drizzle. The weather remained dreary and damp for most of Christmas break, which meant sledging wasn't an option, nor were the snowball battles. This made for a boring first few days before Christmas, which they tried to make up for with trips to the village under Mr. Potter's huge black umbrella. The three boys spent their afternoon in the Muggle cinema there, a novelty to both Sirius and James. It was Remus, of course, who convinced them to go, babbling on about a film called Death Wish, which apparently his Muggle friends— it was still disconcerting to Sirius to hear him talk about friends outside of Hogwarts— had told him about over the summer. Admittedly, it was quite good, though Sirius had his doubts. He found himself enraptured by the moving pictures that he'd read about in Muggle studies, which were quite violent and highly entertaining. It was especially interesting to figure out how, exactly, the pictures were moving without magic. Their textbook had been a bit iffy about that part. The boys ended up going to see the film twice, so that James and Sirius could try to figure out how the projector worked. The third time round, though, neither was very eager to see the same film again, although Remus seemed just as excited about it as he had been the first two previous viewings. Still, there was nothing much else to do, so James and Sirius agreed to go back. They were discussing the mysterious workings of the projector as they stepped into the queue, only to find themselves directly behind a group of Muggle girls. Peter's surprise win when it came to the snogging bet hadn't been forgotten, and Sirius was determined to kiss someone before the end of the year, if only to salvage his reputation. The only problem was that now there were technically no stakes behind it. as he'd already paid out his galleons to Pete, which meant that if he snogged a girl at Hogwarts, people might think he was doing it because he fancied her, and that would ruin his image of the aloof heartbreaker of Gryffindor Tower. These Muggle girls, though, well, they weren't bad-looking, dressed in all mini-skirts, even though it was December. They kept glancing back and giggling, batting their eyelashes the way that girls did when they were trying to flirt with you. Sirius leaned against the wall, trying to look effortless and cool, staring at the freckled girl with honey-blonde curls. She had very long legs and a very nice smile. The girls finished buying their tickets and went to the second screen. Remus stepped up to the booth, counting out the Muggle money that Mr. Potter had given them. "Moony," Sirius said quickly, knowing well enough to take an opportunity when it presented itself. "How about we see something different today?" "Yeah," James agreed, trying to flatten his hair. Remus glanced up skeptically at the poster above the door. The Great Gatsby. He wrinkled his nose. "Ugh, it's a romance, though. What do you want to go see that for?" The two ignored his protests, ushering him into the second screen. Remus settled into the front row with a resigned sigh, and James and Sirius sat down next to him. When Sirius turned to glance behind them, the theatre was mostly empty. The freckled girl caught his eye, wiggling her fingers in a shy wave as her friends giggled beside her. As the lights went down, Sirius felt his heart speed up. This was it. His chance to officially snog a girl, no strings attached. If it went horribly, he could take comfort in the knowledge that he would never see her again, and no one at school would have to find out that he had no idea what he was doing when it came to kissing. He waited for a few minutes, trying to work up the courage to sneak back. What if he'd misread the looks the girls were giving him, and he went back only for them to laugh at him and turn him away? He would never be able to live it down. But no. He definitely knew how to recognize flirting by now, and what had taken place in this small, slightly sticky Muggle picture house was most definitely flirting. Next to him, James was bouncing his leg nervously, and Sirius knew that his friend was thinking along the same lines. At least if they went back together, James wouldn't be able to make fun of him if they both got rejected. But Remus would. Bollocks. Sirius elbowed James, shooting him a meaningful look in the dim light of the movie screen. James gave him a look right back, as if to say, "You first." Sirius rolled his eyes and stood, carefully, trying not to draw attention. He crept cautiously out of the front row, which James followed closely behind. Remus appeared to be completely unaware of the movement, staring entranced at the characters on the screen. As it turned out, Sirius had not misread the situation, and in a handful of minutes he found himself pulled into the back of the theatre by a long-legged blonde, who pushed him down onto the folding seats. A few places down, James was going through a similar series of motions with one of the girl's friends. "I haven't seen you around here before," she leaned in to whisper, so that her hair tickled his face. Sirius resisted the urge to pull back. "Not from round here," he said, trying to sound nonchalant and mysterious, but it came out a bit strangled. She was straddling his lap. Her skirt was hiked up around her thighs. They were very pale. "My name's Holly," she murmured, smoothing her hands over his shoulders. "What's yours?" Sirius?" She laughed. "Sirius?" "Like the star," he clarified, feeling very stupid. Her brow wrinkled in confusion, but she continued to smile, not seeming to care much either way. Snogging, Sirius soon discovered, was not nearly what it was cracked up to be. He truly had no idea what everyone was going on about. It was mostly just bumping their faces together, trying to figure out how to keep their noses from poking into each other's eyes. When Holly stuck her tongue into his mouth, it tasted like wet popcorn, which was not entirely pleasant. He supposed that it got better as things went on, as they figured out how to best position their faces. But she put his hands on her thighs, and stuck her fingers in his hair. He had no idea what to do with his own fingers, and settled for squeezing, gently. She was very soft. At one point Holly pulled back to begin kissing his jaw, but it was a bit awkward in the dark. She didn't seem to quite know where his face was, and ended up just sloppily kissing under his eye. There was still a third of the movie left when Sirius finally extracted himself, weathering one last peck from Holly before she hopped off his lap and pranced back over to her friends, who immediately began squealing and whispering. Sirius grabbed James, and the two of them made their way back to the front row, only to find that Remus had disappeared. They turned to scan the theatre, but Holly and her friends were all in one place, and there didn't appear to be a gangly boy amongst them. They found him sitting at a bus stop down the road from the theatre. Remus was staring at his shoes with a stormy expression, hands shoved into his pockets. "Oi, Mooney!" James called out from under the umbrella. They were across the street, and he had to wait for a few cars to trundle past before they crossed. Remus acted as if he hadn't heard them. "Where are you off to?" Sirius teased as they joined him under the bus shelter. "Just sitting here," Remus muttered, sullen. "Why'd you leave?" "I could ask you the same." "We only popped off for a minute." "Ugh, I don't want to hear about it." Remus covered his ears childishly. He glared at James. "What about Lily?" "What about it's not time yet, but I don't mind?" James blanched at the words, and Sirius laughed at his friend's stricken expression. He slapped Remus across the shoulder good-naturedly, saying, "Oh, come off it. Evans isn't going to care if Potter snogged some muggle girl when he was 14. Calm down, Mooney." Sirius had no idea why Remus was so worked up, but Remus's expression only darkened. "No," he growled. "You make me watch a stupid girls' film just so you could go and grope a couple of muggle birds in the back row." Sirius rolled his eyes, growing impatient. "Merlin, Lupin! We can go and see your beloved Charles Bronson movie tomorrow if you really want. I mean, excuse me if I want to act like a normal teenager for 5 minutes." He hadn't really meant anything by it, but Remus's face went red with anger. Before Sirius could blink, Lupin was swinging his fists with such vigorous speed that he didn't even have time to raise his arms in defense. The first punch got him square in the face, and Sirius reeled back. When he'd regained his balance, he swung in retaliation, and there was a quick series of slobbing back and forth blows before James was wrenching them apart. Sirius could feel his blood trickling from his nose, and he felt a vicious twist of satisfaction when he saw Remus hadn't gotten away unscathed either. A black eye was forming on his flushed face. "What's wrong with you two?" James huffed, dragging them both through the rain back to his parents' house. "He's a tosser," Remus seethed, covering his bruised eye to protect it from the rain. "He's a wanker!" Sirius shot back, pressing his damp jumper against his nose. "You're both dickheads," James said firmly, unlocking the front gate. It took no time at all for Mrs. Potter to fix them up. She was very apt with healing spells, although she spent a bit more time telling them off, which was mitigated only slightly by Mr. Potter, who stood behind her looking very amused and saying, "Boys will be boys, Effie dear." Remus sulked off for the rest of the evening, shutting himself in the room where he was staying and ignoring all of the other boys in favour of his homework. At dinner, he wouldn't even speak to them, opening his mouth only for polite exchanges with Mr. and Mrs. Potter between bites of food. When they were excused, he disappeared back to his room, shutting the door with a bit more force than necessary. "Bloody hell," Sirius fumed, as he and James dressed for bed. "He's becoming worse than Peter, I swear. If he's going to pout for the rest of the break, he may as well do it back at Hogwarts." James shook his head, smiling dryly. "You'll want to talk." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Mate, all you've done is rant about Remus since we got back. Because he's being ridiculous." James sighed, shaking his head once more. "What?" Sirius frowned as James turned to look at him, raising a brow. "Come on, Black. You've got to admit that what you said was it was a bit harsh." Sirius huffed. "I don't know what you're talking about." James gave him a look. "Saying he's not normal. What do you think he's been hearing his whole life, mate? For Merlin's sake, he's a bloody, you know, that furry little problem." Sirius scowled, processing James's words. The other boy released another long, suffering sigh, saying, "I swear, Black, sometimes you go for the throat without even realizing it." Sirius frowned, considering this, and when he didn't respond, James seemed to decide that it was best to move on. They sat on his bed, discussing their respective experiences in the back row of the cinema. Apparently James's partner had been chewing some sort of minty gum, which had made his experience much more agreeable. Once they'd finished, James pulled out a few spell books that he'd found tucked away in his dad's office, which contained paragraphs on animagi magic. They were poring over the texts when a shuffling noise came from outside the door. James went to investigate, poking his head out into the hallway. After a few moments he returned, leaving the door open behind him so that Remus could step through. Sirius frowned apprehensively as the two boys approached the bed. Remembering James's admonishment from earlier, an uneasy mixture of guilt and lingering frustration churned in his gut. James sighed when he caught sight of the wary expression. "Oh, come on. We're all friends, right? It's Christmas." Sirius couldn't very well argue with that. He nodded, and Remus nodded back. The tall boy climbed onto the bed, glancing down at the spellbooks curiously. "Homework?" he asked. "Prank," James replied quickly. "Haven't worked out the kinks yet, though." "Oh, all right." Remus nodded. After a moment, he said cautiously, "How's your nose, Black?" "Fine." Sirius grinned, relieved that Mooney was acting more like himself. "You're losing your touch." Remus smirked. "Oh, yeah? Ask Snape. Headbutted him on the train in September." "You never did." "Yup. Bloody hell," James laughed. "And he hasn't tried it on since." "Not yet." Remus shrugged, nonchalant. "Probably planning something, though. What's the prank?" "Well, we'll tell you when we know how to do it. Might not come off right," James said hurriedly, closing the nearest book before Remus could get a good look. He raised an eyebrow but didn't push it any further, instead saying, "Sorry I brought up Lily. Didn't mean it. Sirius is right, she won't care. If she's stupid enough to go out with you, that is." James gave him a playful shove. "Piss off." "At least that stupid competition is over now, yeah?" Remus asked hopefully, shooting a glance towards Sirius. "Yeah, I suppose," he shrugged in response. "We paid Peter his dues, anyway. What a letdown, though. Snogging, I mean. I don't know what all the fuss is about." "Oh, it was all right," James said thoughtfully. "Probably takes practice. Must get better." "It better had," Sirius said grimly, which caused James and Remus to burst out laughing. Sirius had a very odd dream that night. He was in the back of the cinema, only the screen this time was a portrait of the fat lady, and when he climbed through it, he was in the Gryffindor common room, which was still a cinema, full of rows of folding seats. Holly was there, and she led him to the back row, pushing him down with enough force that his head smacked against the wall behind the seat. Then she was on him, fingers in his hair, except they were longer, thinner, and she smelled like ink, and his tongue tasted of iron and earth, and it was a full moon, and Sirius's nose was bleeding, and someone was screaming in the woods. He jerked awake, sweating, heart pounding. Next to him James was snoring, and a few feet over Remus was stretched out. They'd all fallen asleep on James's bed, talking until they were too tired to keep their eyes open. Sirius could still taste blood on his tongue. Fragments of the dream blurred together in his mind, hazy and indistinct. He turned over and fell back asleep, and by the morning he had forgotten the strange dream completely. Christmas Day, 1974. The weather on Christmas morning was just as gloomy as it had been all break. Rain pattered against the window, a steady beat in the background. But inside the Potter's house it was cheerful and warm and festively decorated as ever. The 5 of them gathered for a heavy breakfast with everyone in high spirits. After breakfast came presents, with all the usual hullabaloo of tearing wrapping paper and abandoning boxes as they exclaimed over gifts they'd received. Remus received a hand-knitted scarf from Lily Evans, which James eyed enviously, and Sirius teased him mercilessly for. Mrs. Potter innocently asked if Lily was Remus's girlfriend, which made both Remus and James flush bright red and sent Sirius into a fit of hysterical laughter. They had just finished up with the presents, Mrs. Potter casting a quick vanishing charm to clean up the mess of colourful paper, when a mournful song rang out loudly from the hallway. It was eerie, high-pitched and haunting, alien and ethereal, and so beautiful that it made Sirius uncomfortable. They all turned at once, Mr. and Mrs. Potter preparing their wands, in a duelling stance, when an unfamiliar silver bird soared into the room, circling their heads. Sirius squinted at it, and realized after a moment that it must be a Patronus, which he'd only seen someone cast a handful of times before. "Dumbledore," Mr. Potter breathed, as the Patronus, which Sirius thought, after getting a closer look, must be a phoenix, settled onto the mantelpiece. Sure enough, it opened its beak and began to speak in the headmaster's voice. "There's been an attack. I'll be with you shortly. Do not allow anyone else entry." Message delivered, the Patronus disappeared, vanishing like a simmering mirage. There was a moment of silence before Mrs. Potter spoke, reaching out for James's shoulder as if to steady herself. "Oh, Monty, an attack!" No need to panic, Mr. Potter said calmly. Albus will be here soon. Boys, finish cleaning up here, eh? I'll be in the study. Sirius tidied up half-heartedly, feeling sick to his stomach. An attack! He thought of the meetings his family had attended that summer, the whispers about a dark lord and the new age of wizarding purity. He thought about Reg, tight-lipped and wide-eyed, eyes sharpening like a blade. He felt very aware of his friends darting nervous glances at him. Were they thinking what he was thinking? Were they wondering if his family had anything to do with it? Were they looking at him and seeing his mother? His father? His brother? He stared out of the window, watching the rain turn the sky a blurry grey. It felt like ages before they finally heard the telltale crack of apparition outside, and Mr. Potter hurried down to the front door. Mrs. Potter went with him, and the marauders hung back in the hallway, watching. The door swung open to reveal Dumbledore, face drawn and clothes dry despite the deluge outside. "Fleamont, Euphemia," he greeted, nodding politely. Mr. Potter raised his wand. "What was the last thing we spoke about?" "Your son having broken his record for number of detentions this term." Dumbledore smiled, glancing back at James, who blushed. Mr. Potter nodded, stepping aside and ushering the old wizard in. "Oh, come in, Dumbledore. Would you like some tea?" Mrs. Potter asked, taking his travelling cloak and guiding him to the living room. "Upstairs, boys," Mr. Potter ordered. James looked as if he wanted to protest, but Dumbledore spoke up. "If you wouldn't mind, Fleamont, I think it best that the boys hear this. It'll be all over the papers tomorrow anyway." Mr. Potter exchanged a glance with his wife, then nodded, slowly. They all adjourned in the living room, where they sat and waited for Gully to bring tea. It was a strangely discordant scene, ornaments twinkling bright on the tree, and the fire leapt cheerfully in the grate, and brightly coloured Christmas cards decorated the walls all over the spread of opened presents. Dumbledore sat, looking very grim and out of place, in his midnight blue robes. Sirius, James, and Remus squished together on the sofa, while Mr. Potter remained standing, pacing the room with the same nervous energy that his son often exhibited before a Quidditch match. "An attack, then?" he asked finally, impatient. "I'm afraid so. The Fraser family in Newcastle." "Fraser? I've never heard of them." "No. Mr. and Mrs. Fraser were both Muggle-born. They had 2 children not yet old enough for Hogwarts, but as far as we know, showing signs of magical ability." Sirius's throat went dry. "Were. That meant—" Mr. Potter had gone pale. "All 4 of them?" "Yes, I'm afraid so." Mrs. Potter pressed a hand to her mouth, horrified. "Children!" she gasped. "Children!" "And you do know for sure?" Mr. Potter said, anxiously. "We know it was him." "Voldemort, yes. He left a mark." "A mark?" "It will be in the papers tomorrow, I imagine. The Daily Prophet was there before I was alerted." "But what does it mean? Who were the Frasers?" "Mr. Fraser worked for St. Mungo's," Dumbledore answered warily. "He recently raised a petition with the Ministry suggesting that healers receive training in Muggle healing techniques. First aid, I believed he called it. This didn't go down very well with certain factions, as I'm sure you can imagine." Sirius swallowed. He remembered his father saying something about that over the summer, complaining about muddying ancient healing techniques with Muggle filth. He had been lobbying against it at the Ministry. "I think I remember Darius saying something," Mr. Potter said faintly, leaning one hand on the mantelpiece as he thought. "But to kill—" "It hasn't been the first time," Dumbledore said darkly. "But it is the first time they have made themselves known. This mark that was left behind, it has been seen elsewhere. Some of the old families have adopted it, a kind of secret sign to their allegiance to Voldemort. Only not so secret anymore." "Which families?" Sirius asked, staring indignantly at Dumbledore. He needed to know. One way or another, his head was spinning, circling the thoughts of all those meetings like water spiralling down a drain. Dumbledore gave him a pitying look that made his skin crawl. "There is so far nothing to link the Blacks to the attack." "So far," Sirius repeated, numb. "But you know they're—" He couldn't bring himself to say it. "It doesn't help anyone to jump to conclusions." Dumbledore held up a hand. "The situation is grave, yes, but we must not lose our heads, or allow emotion to cloud our judgment. There are difficult times ahead, and we need each other to be vigilant." Sirius felt his chest go tight. The meetings. Reg had gone to those meetings. Was he? But he couldn't. He didn't even believe that. "I'm not trying to frighten anyone," Dumbledore continued, pulling Sirius away from the dark turn his thoughts had taken. "But nor do I wish to devalue the seriousness of today's events. I'm working quickly to gather support, a line of defense against Voldemort. I've already spoken to a number of trustworthy associates within the Ministry. Fleamont, can I count on you?" "Of course," Mr. Potter responded immediately. "Have you spoken to the Weasleys, the Pettigrews, the Bones?" Dumbledore nodded, smiling. "On my list, of course." "We can help," James spoke up confidently. Mrs. Potter sucked in a breath, pressing her hand to her heart. "Yeah," Sirius agreed eagerly. "You can depend on us, sir. I'm not like my family, I promise." Sirius remained silent, but nodded next to them, eyes wide. "I hope it won't come to that," Dumbledore said with a kind smile, eyes twinkling proudly as he studied them. "But thank you, boys." "No!" Mrs. Potter exclaimed. "They're children, Dumbledore." "I'm of age in 2 years," Sirius protested, sitting up a bit taller. "And we're the best in the year at defensive spells." "And hexes," James added, though he was quickly silenced by a look from his mother. Dumbledore chuckled softly. "Indeed. Your mother is quite right, however. All I ask is that you're on your guard, and that you look after each other. Now, I must be going. I have other calls to make. Fleamont," Dumbledore stood, shaking Mr. Potter's hand. "I will be in touch. Euphemia," he offered Mrs. Potter an apologetic smile. "Merry Christmas. I'm afraid I won't be attending your party tonight." "We may as well cancel it," Mrs. Potter murmured, shivering. "It seems disrespectful." "Enjoy your holiday, boys. Remus, Madame Pomfrey will meet you at the Three Broomsticks flue stop on Sunday morning." Remus nodded mutely, and with that Dumbledore vanished with a loud crack.